lettuce on your sandwich, Mother?" Charles Wallace asked. "No, thank you." He cut the sandwich into sections, put it on a plate, and set it in front of his mother. "Yours'll be along in just a minute, Meg. I think I'll talk to Mrs. Watson about you." "Who's Mrs. Watson?" Meg asked. "I think I want to be exclusive about her for a while," Charles Wallace said. "Onion salt?" "Yes, please." "What's Mrs. Watson stand for?" Mrs. Murray asked. "That's her name," Charles Wallace answered. "You know, the old shingled house back in the woods that the kids won't go near because they say it's haunted? That's where they live." "They?" "Mrs. Watson and her two friends. I was out with Fortinbras a couple of days ago. You and the twins were at school, Meg. We like to walk in the woods, and suddenly he took off after a squirrel, and I took off after him, and we ended up by the haunted house, so I met them by accident, as you might say." "But nobody lives there," Meg said. "Well, Mrs. Watson and her friends do. They're very enjoyable." "Why didn't you tell me about it before?" Mrs. Murray asked. "And you know you're not supposed to go off our property without permission, Charles." "I know," Charles said. "That's one reason I didn't tell you. I just rushed off after Fortinbras without thinking. And then I decided, well, I'd better save them for an emergency, anyhow." A fresh gust of wind took the house and shook it, and suddenly the rain began to lash against the windows. "I don't think I like this wind," Meg said nervously. "We'll lose some of the shingles off the roof, that's certain," Mrs. Murray said. "But this house has stood for almost 200 years, and I think it will last a little longer, Meg. There's been many a high wind on this hill." "But this is a hurricane!" Meg wailed. "The radio kept saying it was a hurricane." "It's October," Mrs. Murray told her. "There've been storms in October before." As Charles Wallace gave Meg her sandwich, Fortinbras came out from under the table. He gave a long, low growl, and they could see the dark fur slowly rising on his back. Meg felt her own skin prickle. "What's wrong?" she asked anxiously. Fortinbras stared at the door that opened into Mrs. Murray's laboratory, which was in the old stone dairy right off the kitchen. Beyond the lab, a pantry led outdoors, though Mrs. Murray had done her best to train the family to come into the house through the garage door or the front door, and not through her lab. But it was the lab door and not the garage door toward which Fortinbras was growling. "You didn't leave any nasty-smelling chemicals cooking over a Bunsen burner, did you, Mother?" Charles Wallace asked. Mrs. Murray stood up. "No, but I think I'd better go see what's upsetting Fort, anyhow." "It's the tramp! I'm sure it's the tramp!" Meg said nervously. "What tramp?" Charles Wallace asked. "They were saying at the post office this afternoon that a tramp stole all Mrs. Buncombe's sheets." "We'd better sit on the pillowcases then," Mrs. Murray said lightly. "I don't think even a tramp would be out on a night like this, Meg." "But that's probably why he's out," she wailed, "trying to find a place not to be out." "In which case I'll offer him the barn till morning." Mrs. Murray went briskly to the door. "I'll go with you." Meg's voice was shrill. "No, Meg, stay with Charles and eat your sandwich." "Eat!" Meg exclaimed as Mrs. Murray went through the lab. "How does she expect me to eat?" "Mother can take care of herself," Charles said. "Physically, that is." But he sat in his father's chair at the table, and his legs kicked at the rungs, and Charles Wallace, unlike most small children, had the ability to sit still. After a few moments that seemed like forever to Meg, Mrs. Murray came back in, holding the door open for... was it the tramp? It seemed small for Meg's idea of a tramp. The age or sex was impossible to tell, for it was completely bundled up in clothes. Several scarves of assorted colors were tied about the head, and a man's felt hat perched atop. A shocking pink stole was knotted about a rough overcoat, and black rubber boots covered the feet. "Mrs. Watsit," Charles said suspiciously, "what are you doing here, and at this time of night, too?" "Now, don't be worried, my honey," a voice emerged from among the turned-up coat collar, stole, scarves, and hat, a voice like an unoiled gate, but somehow not unpleasant. "Mrs. Watsit says she's lost her way," Mrs. Murray said. "Would you care for some hot chocolate, Mrs. Watsit?" "Charmed, I'm sure," Mrs. Watsit answered, taking off the hat and the dye stole. "It isn't so much that I lost my way as that I got blown off course. And when I realized that I was at little Charles Wallace's house, I thought I'd just come in and rest a bit before proceeding on my way." "How did you know this was Charles Wallace's house?" Meg asked. "By the smell." Mrs. Watson untied a blue and green paisley scarf, a red and yellow flowered print, a gold Liberty print, a red and black bandana. Under all this a sparse quantity of grayish hair was tied in a small but tidy knot on top of her head. Her eyes were bright, her nose a round soft blob, her mouth puckered like an autumn apple.